Ever think about the old cooking tricks we wish we'd learned sooner? Those cookbook tips made life easier when every meal counted. How did we let them fade away? Baking powder biscuits with mayo. Instead of butter might sound strange now, but it was one of the smartest tricks to come out of old cookbooks during hard times. Back in the Depression, and even during the war, butter was not just expensive, it was rationed or impossible to find in many homes. But mayonnaise? It was cheap, shelf-stable, and available in almost every pantry. These cookbooks taught families to swap butter for mayo when mixing biscuit dough, and the results were surprisingly good. The mayo kept the biscuits fluffy, moist, and full of flavor, even without a single pat of butter in sight. Plus, it made the process faster. No cutting in cold butter or worrying about it melting. You could just stir the ingredients together and bake. The biscuits came out soft in the middle with that golden top everyone loved. These little kitchen tricks were all about stretching ingredients and getting the most out of what you had. And honestly, I wish I had known this one sooner. Think how many breakfasts and dinners could have been saved with one jar of mayonnaise and an old cookbook on hand. Foil packet dinners for the oven were one of those classic time-saving tricks hiding in plain sight in vintage cookbooks. You would grab some meat, whatever vegetables were left in the crisper, season it up with whatever was on hand, and toss it all together in a foil pouch. That foil packet went straight in the oven, and dinner basically cooked itself. You ended up with juicy, flavorful meat and tender veggies, all without dirtying a mountain of pans or standing over a hot stove. During the 60s and 70s, this trick was a lifesaver for busy families, especially with both parents working or stretching tight grocery budgets. It showed up everywhere, from community cookbooks to those little recipe cards tucked inside butter cartons. Honestly, it is genius when you think about it. The steam inside the foil kept everything moist, the flavors mingled together perfectly, and cleanup was nothing but tossing out the foil. Looking back, I cannot believe how many chaotic weeknights could have been solved with one roll of foil and a little cookbook wisdom. This one definitely should have been passed down sooner. Keeping pancakes warm with a towel-wrapped plate sounds simple, but it is pure old-school brilliance from the breakfast tables of the 50s and 60s. If you ever tried making pancakes for a crowd, you know the first ones go cold by the time the last batch hits the griddle. But back then, home cooks had a fix. You would stack the pancakes on a warm plate, wrap the whole thing in a clean kitchen towel, and set it aside while you finished cooking. The towel trapped the heat, kept the pancakes soft, and stopped them from drying out or getting rubbery. It was especially handy when you had kids running around or guests at the table and everyone wanted their plate full at the same time. You will not find this trick in modern fancy brunch spots, but it was a must-know for busy home cooks who did not have time for soggy, cold pancakes. Thinking back on rushed mornings or those burnt last-minute batches, I cannot help but wish someone handed me this tip a lot earlier. Rolling pie dough with a glass bottle was one of those forgotten kitchen hacks tucked in the back pages of old cookbooks, but it saved many a holiday dessert. Rolling pins were not always on hand in every kitchen, especially during leaner times when gadgets took a back seat to essentials. But guess what? An old glass soda bottle did the job just as well. You would wash it, maybe chill it in the fridge, and use it to roll out pie dough as evenly as anything from a fancy kitchen shop. It worked great for cookies or crackers too. Plus, the glass stayed cool, which was exactly what you wanted for flaky pastry dough. Families back then knew how to stretch their tools and their groceries, turning simple bottles into kitchen lifesavers. If you grew up thinking baking needed expensive gear, this little trick was a game changer. Honestly, all those messy pie crust attempts of mine could have gone a lot smoother if I had known you just needed an old soda bottle and a little old-fashioned know-how. Stretching meatloaf with shredded potato or oats was a kitchen trick every thrifty cook from the 50s to the 70s probably kept up their sleeve. Meat was expensive, and feeding a whole family on 1 pound of ground beef took some serious creativity. That is where potatoes or oats came in. You would grate up leftover potatoes or toss in some rolled oats, mix it with the meat, and suddenly your loaf went twice as far. It was not just about saving money either. The texture stayed tender, the loaf held together better, and it soaked up whatever seasonings you had on hand. Old cookbooks were filled with variations on this trick, especially in communities where groceries stretched thin. Honestly, I spent way too many years making dense, dry meatloaf without knowing this one. Imagine how many dinners could have turned out softer, tastier, and more filling with just one old cookbook tip passed down in time. Turning leftover mashed potatoes into quick potato cakes is the kind of kitchen trick you find buried in old recipe cards. The forgotten wisdom that saved breakfast more times than we will ever know. Leftover mashed potatoes are tricky. Let them sit in the fridge too long, and they turn into sad, gluey lumps no one wants. But home cooks back in the day knew better. They would grab that cold mash, form little patties, and fry them up in a skillet until golden and crispy on the outside, soft in the middle. Suddenly, those leftovers became a whole new meal, hot, comforting, and filling. It was a common breakfast in farm towns and city kitchens alike, showing up at the table with eggs, bacon, or just on their own. You will not see it much on brunch menus today, but honestly, I wish I had learned this sooner. So many leftovers wasted when they could have turned into crispy, golden potato cakes with just one old cookbook trick. Using evaporated milk to make creamy sauces was one of those pantry hacks from vintage cookbooks that stretched groceries and made dinner feel fancier than it was. Back when refrigeration was spotty and cream was expensive or hard to find, families turned to canned evaporated milk. It kept on the shelf for months, and when mixed into sauces, soups, or casseroles, it brought all the creamy richness you wanted, without spoiling or blowing the grocery budget. You would see this trick in church cookbooks, community recipe swaps, and clipped from old magazines. It made macaroni and cheese silkier, turned tomato soup velvety, and added depth to gravies and pot pies. Looking back, I cannot count how many bland sauces could have been saved if someone had passed this one down to me sooner. It is the kind of old-school wisdom that makes you appreciate how resourceful cooks really were. Reheating bread in a damp paper bag for freshness is one of those little kitchen secrets tucked away in dusty cookbooks that honestly feels like magic when you try it. Stale bread was a fact of life for families back then. Bakeries were not always close, and groceries did not stay fresh as long. But folks knew a clever fix. You would take your day-old loaf, wrap it in a damp paper bag, and pop it in the oven for a few minutes. The steam softened the crust, warmed the inside, and brought the bread back to life like it had just come from the oven. It worked on rolls, buns, even dinner loaves when payday was still far away. This was the kind of trick that saved sandwiches, soups, and family dinners more times than people probably admitted. I wish I had stumbled on this sooner, thinking of how many rock-hard baguettes and stale rolls I tossed out that could have been saved with one old cookbook tip. Quick pickling vegetables with vinegar and sugar was pure genius for stretching meals and adding flavor when groceries ran thin. Home cooks back then knew how to make ingredients pull double duty, and pickling was their go-to trick for brightening up plates without fancy seasonings or expensive sides. You would slice up cucumbers, onions, or whatever veggies were on hand, toss them in a mix of vinegar, sugar, salt, and water, and let them sit for a few hours or even minutes. Suddenly, you had tangy, crisp pickles to serve alongside sandwiches, pot roasts, or beans. It added crunch, cut through heavy meals, and made leftovers feel new again. Quick pickles showed up in nearly every old cookbook for a reason. They were fast, cheap, and full of flavor when budgets were tight. It is the kind of trick I wish had landed in my kitchen sooner. How many dull, plain dinners could have been saved with just vinegar, sugar, and a little old-school know-how? Grating cold butter with a cheese grater for pastry dough is one of those brilliant cookbook hacks that feels obvious once you know it. But nobody ever teaches you unless they hand down the trick. Flaky pie crust or biscuits depend on keeping your butter cold, but cutting it into flour evenly can be a nightmare, especially if your kitchen is warm. Old cookbooks solve that problem with one simple step: grate your butter like cheese. You would chill the stick, run it across the box grater, and suddenly, perfectly tiny shreds of butter fall into your flour mix. It blends faster, stays cold, and gives you that tender, flaky texture every time. Bakers back then leaned on this tip. whether they were making pies for Sunday dinner or biscuits to stretch the meal. Looking back, I cannot believe how many dense crusts or tough biscuits I struggled through before learning this. If someone had passed down this one old cookbook trick sooner, I would have been baking like a pro years ago. Pudding mix. Added to cake batter for moisture is one of those sneaky little shortcuts tucked inside the pages of old community cookbooks, and it works better than most people realize. Back in the 60s and 70s, boxed cake mixes were already the hero of the busy home cook, but they did not always turn out bakery soft. That is where instant pudding mix came in. You would stir it straight into the cake batter. No fancy steps, just dump and mix. And suddenly your cake came out unbelievably moist and rich. It worked for sheet cakes, layer cakes, even cupcakes for bake sales or church potlucks. The pudding added moisture, improved the texture, and gave the cake that soft, springy bite you could never get from the plain mix alone. Honestly, I have lost count of how many dry, crumbly cakes I baked before learning this old cookbook trick. One little box of pudding mix sitting right there in the pantry, and I had no clue it could save my dessert game entirely. Making buttermilk with vinegar and regular milk was one of the earliest cooking tricks I wish I had known sooner. Buttermilk gives pancakes, biscuits, and dressings that signature tang and soft texture, but it is the one ingredient I always seemed to be missing when I needed it. Old cookbooks had the answer. Pour a tablespoon of vinegar into a cup of milk, stir, and let it sit for a few minutes. That was it. You just made your own buttermilk ready for baking or cooking without running to the store. It worked perfectly for fluffy biscuits, tender pancakes, or even creamy ranch dressing. You saved time, money, and a whole lot of frustration trying to track down a carton of the real thing. This was the kind of practical, budget-friendly kitchen trick that folks leaned on for decades. Looking back, all those flat pancakes and dry biscuits could have been avoided if someone had just passed this old cookbook trick down sooner. Salting eggplant to remove bitterness. Before frying is one of those small, forgotten prep steps that makes a huge difference, and it comes straight from vintage cookbooks. Eggplant can be tricky to cook. Slice it up and fry it straight away, and it often turns rubbery or leaves a bitter aftertaste. But home cooks back in the day knew the trick. You would slice the eggplant, sprinkle it generously with salt, and let it sit for about 30 minutes. The salt pulled out excess moisture and toned down the bitterness, making the eggplant tender, creamy, and perfect for frying or baking. It showed up in old Italian-American cookbooks, diner recipes, and handwritten cards tucked in recipe boxes. Honestly, I ruined so many meals trying to wing it with eggplant before learning this. If only someone had handed me this simple, time-tested trick sooner, I could have saved a lot of frying oil and my pride. Browning butter for richer baked goods was a classic technique that somehow slipped through the cracks of modern shortcuts, but it transforms your baking completely. Back when recipes leaned more on simple ingredients and pantry staples, cooks had to get creative with flavor. Browning butter was one of the smartest moves they had. You would melt the butter gently on the stove until it turned golden and smelled nutty, then stir it into cookies, cakes, or muffins. The result? A rich, toasted depth that made your baked goods taste like they came from a fancy bakery, even though they used basic ingredients. This trick was buried in old cookbooks from the 50s and 60s, but somewhere along the line, we forgot it in favor of quick mixes and pre-made dough. Looking back, I cannot believe how many flat, flavorless batches of cookies I made before finally learning to brown butter. Some cookbook wisdom should never get lost. Storing brown sugar with a slice of bread is such a small, brilliant kitchen hack that it feels criminal I did not know it sooner. Brown sugar loves to clump and harden, turning into one rock-solid brick that ruins your baking plans. But old cookbooks had the answer all along. You just tuck a slice of bread into the sugar container and close the lid. The bread's moisture softens the sugar, keeping it fluffy and ready to use for weeks. It worked wonders for cookie dough, muffins, or anything that called for that sweet molasses flavor. Folks in the 60s and 70s relied on this trick, especially when ingredients had to stretch longer between grocery trips. Honestly, I have chipped away at enough hardened sugar to wish someone shared this sooner. One slice of bread, one old cookbook tip, and no more ruined recipes. Melting marshmallows for quick dessert frosting feels like something straight out of a child's birthday party, but it came from clever old-school cookbook tricks. Back when frosting ingredients like cream or butter were scarce or pricey, families found a shortcut hiding in the pantry: marshmallows. You would melt them down with a splash of milk and spread the gooey mix right over cakes or cupcakes. It cooled into a glossy, fluffy frosting that looked impressive without the time or cost of traditional icing. You would find this trick in community cookbooks and on the back of marshmallow packages from the 60s and 70s. It turned plain cakes into party showstoppers with almost no effort. Thinking back on all those rushed birthdays or last-minute bake sales, I cannot help but wish I had this shortcut sooner. One bag of marshmallows, one old cookbook, and dessert was saved. Adding vinegar to pie crust for flakiness is one of those weird-sounding tricks from old cookbooks that actually works better than expected. Pie crust can be unforgiving, too tough, too chewy, and never quite flaky enough. But cooks in the 50s and 60s had a secret. They added a splash of vinegar to the dough. The acid helped relax the gluten, keeping the crust tender and easy to work with. It also added just enough tang to balance sweet fillings, making fruit pies, quiches, or even pot pies taste better. You would spot this tip scribbled in the margins of recipe cards or buried in vintage baking books. Honestly, I have fought with enough stubborn pie dough to wish someone had handed me this trick sooner. It is small, simple, and changes everything about your baking. Crushing saltines as a budget breadcrumb substitute was one of those Depression-era tricks that quietly stuck around, tucked into old cookbooks and recipe cards. Breadcrumbs add crunch to fried food or bind meatballs, but they were not always easy to come by when pantries ran low. Saltine crackers? Almost every household had a box. You would crush them up fine and use them just like breadcrumbs. They added a crispy coating to fried chicken, stretched ground beef and meatloaf, or even worked as a topping for casseroles. It was practical, frugal, and made dinner stretch farther without sacrificing flavor or texture. Families leaned on this hack during tight times, and honestly, it holds up today. I spent way too many years shelling out for fancy breadcrumbs when a box of crackers and a rolling pin would have done the trick. Sometimes old cookbook tricks really do make the most sense. Baking bacon in the oven for less mess is one of those old cookbook tips that feels so obvious now, but back then it was a game changer for busy kitchens. Frying bacon on the stovetop leaves grease everywhere, countertops, walls, and your clothes. But home cooks figured out a better way. Lay the bacon flat on a baking sheet, pop it in the oven, and let it cook until crisp. No flipping, no splatter, and every slice cooks evenly. It was a lifesaver for Sunday breakfasts or feeding a crowd. You would find this trick tucked in community cookbooks, especially during the 50s and 60s when families cooked big, hearty meals on tight schedules. Honestly, I struggled with uneven, greasy bacon for years before learning this. A simple baking sheet, an oven, and one forgotten old cookbook trick, it changed breakfast forever. Canned pineapple tenderizes meat for skillet meals might sound like a tropical gimmick now, but it was one of those vintage cookbook tricks that really earned its place. Back when meat was expensive or tough cuts were all you could afford, cooks turned to canned pineapple for help. The enzymes in the fruit broke down tough meat fibers, making them softer and more flavorful. You would toss pineapple rings or juice into a skillet with pork chops, chicken, or even beef, and dinner practically made itself. It was especially popular during the 60s and 70s when sweet and savory meals were all the rage. You would find this tip in community cookbooks and on the labels of canned fruit. Looking back, I can only imagine how many chewy, overcooked dinners could have been saved if I had learned this sooner. Sometimes, old-school tricks and a can of pineapple really do make all the difference. Stretching cake. Frosting with whipped evaporated milk was one of those genius dessert tricks that got lost along the way, but it saved countless birthday parties and bake sales in its heyday. Butter and cream were expensive, especially during tight times or rationing, but home cooks still needed a way to frost cakes and keep things looking fancy. That is where chilled evaporated milk came in. You would stick the can in the fridge overnight, pour it into a bowl, and whip it up like cream. It fluffed into a light, airy frosting that stretched farther than any butter-based recipe and cost a fraction of the price. You would find this tip in old dessert books, church cookbooks, and handwritten recipe cards tucked in family drawers. It made cakes look bakery-worthy, even when grocery budgets were stretched thin. Thinking back, I ruined enough frosting jobs trying to stretch butter alone. I wish someone had handed me this old cookbook hack sooner. Floating egg test for freshness might sound like an old wives' tale now, but it was one of the smartest food safety tricks buried in vintage cookbooks. Before printed expiration dates were slapped on every carton, cooks needed a reliable way to check if their eggs were still good. You would fill a bowl with water and gently place the egg inside. If it sank to the bottom and lay flat, it was fresh. If it floated upright or worse, bobbed to the surface, it was time to toss it. This trick showed up in old kitchen guides and recipe booklets from the 40s to the 70s, especially when eggs were scarce and wasting one was not an option. It was simple, practical, and saved countless meals from the horror of cracking open a rotten egg. Honestly, I cannot believe how long I went without knowing this one. One little bowl of water could have saved so many breakfast mishaps if someone had passed this down sooner. Turning leftover coffee into iced dessert drinks was one of those small, frugal joys hidden in the pages of old cookbooks and diner menus. Coffee was a daily essential, but wasting a single drop was out of the question when groceries were tight. So when the pot went cold, folks got creative. You would pour the leftover coffee over ice, add milk or evaporated milk, and stir in a spoonful of sugar or sweetened condensed milk. Suddenly, you had a cool, cafe-style treat at home, without paying diner prices or letting good coffee go to waste. Some even added a scoop of ice cream or a swirl of chocolate syrup when they wanted to dress it up. You would spot this trick in community cookbooks, clipped from magazines or scribbled on recipe cards. Thinking back, I dumped way too many cold coffee pots down the drain before realizing you could turn leftovers into dessert. A little milk, a little sugar, and one old cookbook tip was all it took. Thickening gravy with crushed potato flakes sounds like one of those odd pantry hacks, but if you crack open enough old cookbooks, you will find they swore by it, and for good reason. Back then, flour and cornstarch were not always easy to come by, especially if money was tight or the stores were bare. But instant mashed potato flakes? They were shelf-stable, cheap, and sitting in nearly every pantry across the country by the 1960s. All you had to do was stir a spoonful into thin gravy, soups, or stews, and suddenly the whole pot thickened right up without the clumps or gloopy texture you get when flour is rushed. Plus, the flakes added this mild, hearty taste that made the meal feel even more filling, which counted for a lot when groceries were stretched thin. It was the kind of trick that showed up scribbled on index cards or printed in those little community cookbooks every neighborhood seemed to have. Thinking back on all the runny gravies I tried to fix with panic and cornstarch, I cannot believe how long I went without knowing this one simple shortcut. Sometimes, the smartest tips really were hiding in plain sight. Quick crustless quiche with mayonnaise was one of those forgotten gems tucked into mid-century cookbooks. And honestly, I wish I had stumbled on it sooner. Quiche always sounds easy on paper, but the second you start fussing with pastry dough and rolling pins, the whole thing turns into a project. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, families stretched ingredients and time however they could, and skipping the crust altogether was one clever shortcut. Instead of dough, you mixed eggs with mayonnaise, poured it right into the pan over whatever fillings you had, spinach, cheese, leftover ham, and baked it like a casserole. The mayo added moisture, richness, and just enough structure to hold everything together. No fancy pastry work required. You would find this trick buried in church cookbooks, clipped from women's magazines, or shared at neighborhood potlucks. It tasted fancy, looked impressive, and made breakfast or dinner come together in no time, even when groceries were scarce. Looking back, I skipped making quiche so many times just because I dreaded the dough. Turns out, all I needed was a few eggs, a spoonful of mayo, and one smart old cookbook trick. Using a fork to decorate pie edges, Feels like one of those tiny details that does not matter. But ask anyone who grew up baking in the 1940s or 1950s, they will tell you presentation was everything. Pie crusts are humble, sure, but back then, home cooks still wanted their desserts to look like they belonged in a bakery window, even if they came from a crowded, modest kitchen. You did not need fancy cutters, fluted wheels, or expensive tools either. All it took was the back of a fork. You would press the tines gently along the edge of the pie, leaving behind those neat, ridged marks that made the whole thing look polished and handmade at the same time. It sealed the crust, kept the filling tucked in, and gave pies that picture-perfect finish for Sunday dinner or church potlucks. You would find the tips scribbled in old baking guides, passed down from grandmothers, or tucked into handwritten recipe cards. Thinking back, I cannot count how many lopsided, plain pies I served without knowing this. Turns out, the best finishing touch was already sitting in the silverware drawer all along. Lining cake? Pans with wax paper for easy release was one of those forgotten lifesavers that old cookbooks quietly handed down. And honestly, I wish someone taught me this sooner. You ever bake a cake, flip the pan over, and half the thing stays stuck inside? That was practically a rite of passage before non-stick pans and silicone bakeware came along. But cooks in the 50s and 60s had a fix for that. You would trace the bottom of your cake pan onto wax paper, cut out a neat circle, and lay it inside before pouring in your batter. The cake would bake, rise, and come out perfect. No crumbling edges, no stuck bottoms, no broken birthday cakes when it really mattered. It was such a simple little step that made baking feel foolproof, even when the recipe felt overwhelming. You would find this tip in church cookbooks, handwritten family recipes, and tucked away in those little pamphlets that came with baking powder or shortening. Thinking back on the number of mangled cakes I tried to salvage with extra frosting, I cannot believe I skipped this one for so long. One roll of wax paper really changed the whole game. Making DIY self-rising flour with baking powder and salt was one of those clever tricks buried in the back pages of old cookbooks. But it saved a lot of baking projects when grocery stores were not an easy option. Self-rising flour was a staple for quick breads, biscuits, pancakes, and plenty of old-school recipes, but finding it in the pantry when you needed it? That was never guaranteed. So home cooks just made their own. You would measure out plain flour, stir in the right amount of baking powder and salt, and suddenly you had fluffy, ready-to-go flour without running to the store. It saved time, money, and the headache of cutting recipes short because of one missing ingredient. This trick showed up everywhere. Handwritten recipe cards, clipped magazine tips, even scribbled in the margins of old church cookbooks. Families stretched groceries as far as they could, and little tricks like this kept meals rolling when times were tight. I spent way too many years skipping recipes, thinking I needed some fancy pre-mixed flour, when all it really took was a spoon, a bowl, and a little old cookbook wisdom. Salting pasta water, like the old Italians. Said might sound like a tiny detail, but ask anyone with a grandmother from the old country, and they will tell you it makes all the difference. Boiling pasta in plain water leaves it bland, no matter how rich your sauce is. But the cooks who handed down those old Italian family recipes knew better. You salted the water generously, enough that it tasted like seawater, before dropping in the noodles. That salt flavored the pasta from the inside out, giving the whole dish a heartier, more satisfying bite. Old cookbooks never skipped that step, especially the ones tucked away in Italian-American kitchens from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was a simple, affordable trick that turned a basic pot of noodles into something special without adding extra ingredients. I cannot tell you how many bowls of sad, flavorless spaghetti I served before figuring this out. One pot of water, a heavy hand with the salt shaker, and suddenly dinner actually tasted right. Funny how the smallest cookbook tips can change everything about a meal. Freezing leftover broth in ice cube trays is one of those forgotten kitchen tricks that feels too clever not to use, and it came straight from old-school cookbooks. Broth adds flavor to soups, sauces, and stews, but leftover broth. It usually sat in the fridge until it spoiled, or worse, got poured straight down the drain. Families back then could not afford to waste anything, so they got smart. You would pour leftover broth into ice cube trays, freeze it solid, and pop out cubes whenever you needed a quick flavor boost. Those little broth cubes went straight into sauces, gravies, or casseroles. No defrosting, no waste, and no need to open a new carton for one spoonful. It was a practical trick you would spot in old community cookbooks, wartime guides, and handwritten recipe cards from the 60s and 70s. Honestly, thinking about how many times I tossed out leftover broth because I thought I could not use it fast enough, I wish someone handed me this simple, budget-friendly trick sooner. One ice cube tray, a freezer, and a little old cookbook know-how made all the difference at dinner time. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. So, cranberry salad was such a massive holiday staple, and luckily, this is one thing that has always been consistent throughout American history. Cranberry salad is essentially an incredibly big necessity at these Thanksgiving dinners. It's like you just can't cut the turkey without it, you know? The way you don't ever eat the first slice of cake until the birthday person comes in. Plus, it really didn't help that this dish just naturally went so well with roast turkey, baked ham, and other kinds of holiday classics. Many versions of a classic 50s take on a cranberry salad included incredible amounts of gelatin. This was always raspberry or cherry flavored, but the idea was to mix it in with fresh cranberries and crush it with pineapple. Then, hand-crank grinders were really common before we ever got to having food processors. Homemakers would use them to chop cranberries and oranges together and basically make a delightful little cranberry relish. You could serve it in molds, you could serve it in different styles of salads, it could go with ham, it elevated turkeys. It was one of the few things that natively grew in the country. I mean, it was a miracle worker for such a simple salad. Now, as far as cold and chilled dishes go, a salad is something people can cope with, but cold roasted beef with horseradish sauce? By God, it's almost blasphemy. Really? Cold beef? You ever heard of that? It was a shock to me too. I think most of us have just grown up assuming all meat-related dishes are supposed to be served hot by default, you know? It was these thin slices of roast beef that were packed in a dipping sauce, but it was still something to get used to. Now, I'm not really sure what the idea was behind this. I guess it is true that microwaves weren't exactly a function of everyone's homes, and lots of sandwiches would just go cold. If you eat enough of those, it can definitely develop into like a habit, but to have this as a preference? Chat, I'm just not sure how I feel about this one. What would you guys think? If you give it a yes, I'm taking this to work tomorrow, so just think with caution, okay? That lunch break is really important. Fruit gelatin salad with cream cheese was something that was one of the most popular desserts back then in the 1960s. Jell-O cheap was cheap, really cheap, and it was around 10 to 15 cents per box. The canned fruit here was also wildly inexpensive and something you could find just about anywhere in the American states, really. Now, the most common toppings for fruit gelatin salads were whipped cream, some marshmallows, or cottage cream cheese. This was something that the American suburbia most of all loved more than anyone else. Potlucks, cocktail parties, and a lot more would serve these as regularly as they could. The salad was sweet, it was fruity, it was filled with all kinds of good vitamins and health benefits, and it was something that would get your nagging parents off of your back. Now you could call them and show them that you actually were taking your gut health seriously. As far as the flavor went for this dish, it really could have been anything depending on the kind of fruits you were using. Most people would typically just use pantry staples that they always have worked with and have lying around. It made things easier that way and gave them a lot of familiar options to experiment with before they found out what kind of Jell-O worked best for them. Ham and scalloped potatoes in the 50s were a way for leftover ham to get out of your refrigerator and into your system, just like you paid for. They were also one of the best Sunday inners you could have, and they were a pretty popular choice for potlucks, just the kind that were in churches. Man, I can't begin to describe to you the absolute convenience that canned food brought along with it. Then you'll say that, oh, but canned food has been around since like the 19th century. Sure, but has mass-produced canned food available in every supermarket, grocery store, and mom and pop joint around the corner been a thing? No, right? That was the real shakeup. It basically meant that you had access to things like cream of mushroom soup on the get-go or scalloped potatoes, and then terre was the way people were making the switch to electric ovens. All of this together meant that layered dishes that took a while to make like ham and scalloped potatoes were a lot easier to handle. It wasn't as much of a fuss anymore to layer everything up, and hey, you'd be pretty popular at the potluck if you showed up with this. Stauffer's Welsh Rarebit is a frozen version of the classic Welsh dish, consisting of a cheese sauce poured over toasted bread. This rich and savory dish was introduced by Stauffer's in the mid-20th century, providing a quick and indulgent meal option for cheese lovers. The dish is a take on a traditional Welsh recipe that dates back to the 18th century, known for its comforting blend of cheese and bread. It's made from a blend of cheese, butter, cream, and seasonings, creating a smooth and flavorful sauce that is poured over slices of toasted bread. The dish is typically prepared in the oven or microwave, allowing for easy preparation and serving. Stauffer's Welsh Rarebit is often enjoyed as a lunch or dinner entree, offering a comforting and hearty option that pairs well with a variety of sides, such as salad or vegetables. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil. A dash of salt and you were good to go at basically no cost. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives, and olives or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Have you ever wondered how we got to a point where mushrooms became as popular as they are? Stuffed mushrooms, in particular, were the apple of most people's eyes. A packet of white button mushrooms would run you about 30 cents and keep you satisfied and full for the rest of the evening. The fillings were dirt cheap and probably things you already had on hand in your pantry too. Who doesn't have some breadcrumbs, sausage, basic herbs, and garlic laying around? Plus, mushrooms were largely free for a lot of people. Curious how? During the Depression, people really picked a few survival skills up. One of those happened to be foraging in the wild for fruit and other edible things in the wilderness. People found out that mushrooms were actually one of the greatest gifts nature ever gave us, and they got hooked. Bad. Like, really bad. Mushrooms were seen as an incredibly versatile ingredient. What couldn't you do with these babies? Throw them on pizza, put them in your soup, smash them between a burger, stir-fry them, roast them, serve them at a cocktail party, or just eat them as they are, or put them in a stew. Do you see where I'm going with this? You can't, because I'm going literally everywhere you can imagine. That's how much you can do with just a simple serving of stuffed mushrooms. French versions were often a lot more buttery, while Italian versions were a lot more prone to being filled with garlic. Either way, what you could say for sure in your life was that this is a dish you really wouldn't regret waiting around for. I'm about to tell you something you never saw coming. See, the funny thing about crab cakes and crab in general is that it actually used to be dirt cheap. Yes, I know the first thing in your head was that how could something like crab meat make its way onto a list for food that would give away the fact your bank is hurting a little? Crab is something people save up for when they want a special occasion, or they have someone special to spend on. It's not something you look at as a snack, meal, or just a casual lunch to go out for, and I think that's the narrative most of us have grown up with. Crab cakes would use mixes of fresh crab, breadcrumbs, and eggs, which would make it a really simple dish all around. The cheapness of crabs couldn't be underestimated, as they were actually around just 35 to 60 cents live weight back then. This was something that came with a catch, though, which I think some of you may have seen coming. See, fresh crab meat would go for that cost, but that was only in coastal areas where crabs were abundant. A reason for the increase in price hikes for crabs is because overfishing also damages their numbers throughout the years, and that overfishing started and sowed its seeds in times like these. Outside of these fishing-reliant areas, fresh crab was still a luxury, one that could easily put you short of a couple of dollars. Crab cakes were something that seafood restaurants and places relied on thoroughly, but it was the mid-Atlantic where crab cake culture really shined, both with low-key casual and affordable variants and upscale luxurious crab cake-based dishes. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Flintstones push-up pops are frozen sherbet treats in a tube, featuring characters from the Flintstones on the packaging. These nostalgic treats were introduced in the 1990s by Nestlé, capturing the hearts of children with their fruity and creamy refreshment. The pops are pushed up from the bottom, offering a fun and interactive way to enjoy a cold treat. Flintstones push-up. Pops come in a variety of fruity flavors, such as orange, grape, and cherry, and they are made with a blend of sherbet and ice cream for a smooth and refreshing texture. The sherbet mixture provides a burst of flavor, while the ice cream base offers a creamy finish, creating a delightful contrast. Flintstones push-up pops were often enjoyed as an after-school snack or a summertime refreshment, making them a beloved part of many childhood memories. Ploughman's Lunch was this really traditional British cold meal, and I guess you'll find a lot of these on the list. The basic combo here was basically just bread, some pickles, chutneys, apples, and cheese. You'd also get chutneys, which I'm not sure what that's worth. The British never really made good ones anyway. Hey, I'm only kidding. It's quintessentially a European breakfast though, and over there it's even considered rustic. But over here, just like the previous item, this was considered pretty controversial. Now, most of the setup here was something any pure-blooded American could work with. You have your farmhouse loaves, some sourdough if that's not your type, or even multi-grain bread. We've eaten Subway on hungrier days with those same options, right? It was just the cold meat part that wouldn't vibe well with a lot of people. I mean, really though, what do you expect? This is the land of cookouts with grills, deep-fried chicken fillets, and melted gooey cheese on just about everything. Cold just doesn't fit anywhere in that picture. Cool Whip pie is a simple and creamy dessert made with a Cool Whip filling in a graham cracker crust, often topped with fruit or chocolate. This easy-to-make pie became popular in the late 20th century thanks to its simplicity and delightful taste. The pie is typically made by mixing Cool Whip with ingredients like cream cheese or pudding mix, spreading it into a pre-made graham cracker crust, and then chilling it until set. The versatility of the Cool Whip filling allows for a variety of flavors, such as chocolate, peanut butter, or fruit. The pie is often topped with fresh fruit, chocolate shavings, or nuts, enhancing its flavor and visual appeal. Cool Whip pie is a favorite for gatherings or potlucks, providing a light and refreshing dessert option that is easy to prepare and enjoy. The creamy filling and crunchy crust create a satisfying contrast, making Cool Whip pie a delightful treat that is perfect for any occasion. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. So, despite what you might hear about meatball subs, or what you might even see about them, because let's be honest, we've all seen way too many episodes of Brooklyn 99 where somebody was working a sub, they weren't actually super mainstream. No, they got that reputation in the 60s and 70s, but it was a niche idea and recipe that had pretty much just kept itself to Italian-American communities. It definitely wasn't a local deli item you could expect on every menu, or something that was even a standard. Italian-American communities in cities like Philadelphia and Boston were the first ones who started popularizing this combination. Italian bakeries and delis run by Italian-Americans were one of the first few places that started using homemade meatballs inside of solid sourdough bread, and the idea was beginning to catch on quick. The meatballs were made from a mix of pork, veal, and ground beef, and they were also seasoned with a lot of Parmesan and parsley, but they were slow-cooked in a homemade tomato sauce, which also made them super tender. See, today's subs are different too, because they have all kinds of toppings and melted or shredded mozzarella, but you didn't used to have any of that back then. It wasn't even served on hoagie rolls. Most delis back then kept it on a crusty Italian loaf or a French baguette roll. This was the origin story of meatball subs, as we know them today, you could say. Speaking of influences from different countries, let's talk about coq au vin. This French dish that's pretty much just chicken, wine, and every root vegetable you could consider fine is actually inexpensive despite hailing from the land of the French. See, whole chickens hadn't gone through the apocalyptic plague we know as post-COVID inflation. Back then, you actually could afford to get a chicken off of your minimum wage part-time salary. Isn't that insane? Still, I came here to show you different sides of our culinary history, not reminisce about happier times. Speaking of history, the West and East Coasts had different interpretations of this dish. In San Francisco and California in specific, there was a bustling community of French immigrants that had pretty much settled down wonderfully there. Thanks to that, coq au vin was something that spread like wildfire both among the locals and the French restaurants. There was a demand for it like never before. When slow cookers eventually came around and it made cooking this dish 10 times easier, that demand only skyrocketed. Plus, table wine was really cheap. It was just $1 or $3. Can you imagine that? These are prices from just 60 years ago, by the way. It really puts things into perspective, or puts me awfully close to cheap table wine myself. Care Bears waffles are whimsical waffles shaped like Care Bears characters, offering a fun and playful breakfast option for kids. These colorful waffles were introduced in the 1980s, becoming a popular choice for families looking to add a bit of joy to their morning routine. They were inspired by the Care Bears franchise, which was a beloved children's brand during the 1980s and 1990s. The waffles are typically made from a classic waffle batter, cooked in a waffle iron with Care Bears molds, and then served with toppings like syrup or fruit. The waffles could be customized with various toppings, such as whipped cream, chocolate chips, or sprinkles, allowing for a creative and interactive meal. let's talk about an undisputed heavyweight champion. Let's talk about the Michael Jordan of Sunday dinners. See, you wake up on Sunday, and besides that initial sinking Sunday feeling, you wake up with a lot of hope. The hope that you'll wake, step out, and smell roast chicken with gravy being cooked up in the kitchen. It was a special occasion meal too, but it was something that moms always kept tucked away in their cooking revolver for Sunday, making sure to not make it any day prior. It made the whole thing a family tradition, but you could do that with most dishes if you tied them to a specific day. Bit like Pavlov, isn't it? This one was special purely because of its homeliness and quality. For a long while, it was something that was simple, yet irreplaceable. People thought this was the ultimate Sunday dinner, and it was the golden standard of American food. Simple, a well-balanced and nutritionally sound plate, and easy to eat. It made you tougher, it didn't hurt your wallet, and it tasted amazing. So a lot of people honestly just thought that there was nothing better to make. Beef roasts were popular too, but nothing beat chicken. Also, people had beef for their grilling sessions, so there was that. Macaroni salad with ham cubes is a really nostalgic one. If you look at it from the lens of what was popular in the era at the time, then yeah, sure, macaroni salads were a perfect middle ground between healthier, leaner bowls of salads and the typical macaroni and cheese meals we were all used to. People thought they had to get started somewhere, and well, why not get it going with something you know you can stand? If you look at it historically, then macaroni salad actually goes all the way back to European dishes like pasta fredda, and in the early 20th century, let's say around the 20s and 30s, it was a really popular meal to have as a side dish. During the Depression, it became a staple because you could make so much of it in large batches and still get everyone fed and taken care of. Now, in the war era, the rise of convenience foods meant that mayonnaise and macaroni were getting even more popular and accessible than ever before. It was only natural that people would start adopting macaroni salads, but they needed something to go with it. Some oomph, you know? That definitely came from the smokiness of the ham cubes, which honestly bounced really well off of the macaroni. This salad was a typical lunch in factories, offices, and just about any kind of labor-intensive job you could imagine. It's just a bit sad that people have gone back to Kraft's mac and cheese boxes now, though. Hungry Man dinners are hearty frozen meals designed for big appetites, often featuring meats like turkey or fried chicken with sides like mashed potatoes and corn. These early versions were introduced by Swanson in 1973, aiming to provide a larger portion size than traditional TV dinners. The meals were known for their generous portions and satisfying flavors, making them popular among those with hearty appetites. The original Hungry Man dinners offered a variety of entree options, including Salisbury steak, meatloaf, and pork chops, paired with classic comfort food sides like green beans, mac and cheese, and stuffing. The meals were cooked and served in aluminum trays, allowing for easy preparation and cleanup. The substantial portions and satisfying flavors made Hungry Man dinners a go-to choice for those seeking a comforting and filling meal. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Wish you knew these old cookbook tricks sooner? Drop your favorite in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more forgotten kitchen secrets.